This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You know what inspires me? Fearlessness, drive. I hate lazy people. Barb, stay in school. Don't you ever be lazy. Don't you ever complain about hard work. Work hard, it pays off.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Analysis with Ro. I'm your lovely host, Ro, giving you the latest in everything media, and today is a bit of a special episode because we are, of course, going through Hisoka's character study. We're still on Unit 1, but today is special because we're going through an issue that I feel like can relate to a lot of people in real life. So the education system, right? We talked about before how essentially he lives in the equivalent of America. For him, it's the United States of Sahereta. And for us, it's the United States of America. Sahereta is their version of America. We have ours, obviously, right? And I decided, he was technically their version of American back in the day. He must have grew up in a very similar curriculum to how kids grew up in like the 2000s. What was that like? What issues could have pertained due to that time? Even though I would say for his character, he did not go through traditional public schooling. So like the four walls, the traditional building. We talked about this a little bit earlier in his childhood episode pertaining to him being a child entertainer, that his education would have been like a little bit different in the sense that his teacher pretty much would have been following him around instead of, again, the traditional classroom that you typically think of when you think of school. However, everybody within that district would follow the same exact curriculum. So even though you have more alternative forms of education, everyone's curriculum remains to be the same. So that's pretty much the only key difference is one teacher follows you around because, again, you're a working child, and the other one stays in a classroom because for those kids, the only job that they have is going to school, technically speaking. So we will be referencing kind of that a little bit. We'll be referencing the issues that tend to have pertained to exist around the 2000s, maybe late 90s, 2000s, during that time period specifically. We will not get into the issues of today's classroom, so the age of AI, the literacy crisis of today. We will not be referencing, however, a lot of those issues that we'll be talking about when it comes to the 2000s. It will still persist into today's time. So a lot of those familiar issues that we had back then, we still have today. I would argue that if anything, it's just gotten slightly worse due to tech. But a lot of those issues are going to circle over for those of you that are familiar with the education system. If you are a teacher watching, hello. If you are a student or somebody who used to be a student, whether you are in like K through 12 or even college, you can probably relate to a lot of these issues, because the thing about the U.S. education system as a whole is, I would argue, and a lot of people would agree with me with this argument, barely anything has changed. So if the reason why these issues was like, that still happens today? Yeah, because barely anything has changed. It's like a snail, but probably worse than a snail. Think of anything slower than a snail. That's the progress when it comes to U.S. education, and I would argue that it has regressed since. So we will be going over that. We'll be going over the issues and how that relates to Hisoka's character as a whole, considering that he was educated under that same curriculum. We're going to see how that affects him. We're going to see what those specific issues are. And yeah, we're just going to have a whole bunch of fun with it.
Here's the motherfucking tea.
First things first, let's get into the fact that these schools are outdated, and they still are. Now, the intention of the school system being outdated is very much so intentional. The reason why they're so outdated, you want to really get into the tea as to why they're so outdated and what the purpose of what these schools actually are. Okay, call me a conspiracy theorist for a minute. For a lot of these schools, the original model was pretty much churning out common workers. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is actually facts. That's what the original school was for, to make sure that these workers actually knew what they were doing in factories. Yeah, back in the day. So pretty much they would have them, work in these factories, do this, that, and the fourth. They realized they had all these itty bitty workers to be. And they were like, we need to train all of these workers because of the industrial age. The industrial revolution that you learned back in school? Yeah, it applies here. So what they did was, as a result of that, is they pretty much had everybody be like, hey, you know what we should do? We should install schools so we can have all these kiddos be trained up to one day be amazing workers someday. But don't go a step beyond. They can't go a step beyond. We just want new workers. That's what we're here for. So it's to maintain the status quo. It's to maintain the system. They wanted to keep everybody aligned. The capitalist system. Very specifically. They just wanted to keep everything aligned. They wanted new workers. They didn't want to go a step beyond, right? It's just like, listen, we need somebody in the workforce. They need to know what they're doing while being in the workforce. What are we going to do? We're going to train them. How are we going to train them? Schools. Yeah, get into this program. So schools were made. Schools were built so that these kids could get an education to someday be a common worker. How did that go? Listen. I'm telling you right now, as an end result, at first, it went well because it's like, oh yeah, it served its purpose. But then tech kept advancing. Yeah, things got better. Other countries got more advanced than us. They were ahead of us. The U.S. was like, what's going on? Why are they ahead of us? Well, it's because you didn't update your system to accommodate for that. So they went, okay, I guess we have to accommodate for that. I guess we have no other choice to do that. Yeah, other countries like China, for example, they tend to have prioritized more long-term results. Meanwhile, the U.S. was like, we need immediate workers. China was like, we're going to install skills that will help you long-term rather than the short-term, right? These are more so of the technological skills, for example, or other kinds of skills, but mostly technological skills that will help you in the long run. Meanwhile, the U.S., they were really concerned about having service workers, and that's pretty much it. Or back in the day, factory workers. Nowadays, and even into the 90s and 2000s, service workers. Because, we live in the modern day era. Factories weren't as much of a thing back then. So we had to advance a little bit, but not too much. Versus every other country where they were concerned with the current day advancements to the point where it's like, oh, we got to advance everything. including education. What can you say? Classic United States, always making sure that the capitalist dollars to the best interest. But don't worry, that's only for the lower class folk. Everybody in the upper class had their advancements made. It's only the fact that we still need service workers, so everybody can't advance, only a couple of people. Gotta keep the status quo alive. It did not get any better, right? Because after factories were done, now what? Well, specifically in January 2001, just 3 days after taking office, President Bush announced his plan for education reform. And what did that education reform end up being? Well, some of you might know it as the No Child Left Behind Act. It sounds so sweet. I assure you, it was not as sweet as it sounded. The goal of the act was to improve performance of schools. That was the intention. By increasing accountability, more choices for parents when choosing schools, and an increased focus on reading. Sounds so good, surface level. And it turned out to be an absolute disaster. The intentions, I'm sure, were well. But the results spoke for themselves, because what they brought in to ruin it. You want to know what they did it to really ruin it? What really ruined the day? It could have been just fine. Just absolutely dandy. A delight to have if they didn't introduce standardized testing. Well, they just had to introduce that to us. And as an end result, things really hit the fan. I mean, of course, they had to keep everything kind of factory settings. We couldn't stray too far. Yeah, you have critical thinking skills when it comes to reading, but at the end of the day, you still have to remember you are just a number to us. Don't actually want you to advance too much. That'd be just crazy. But, no, they're not the only country, to be fair, that introduced standardized testing and considered students as nothing more but a number to measure intelligence, which in my humble opinion is not that accurate when it comes to measuring intellect. But hey, what do I know? I wasn't in the boardroom. I didn't make these decisions. I'm just telling you what happened eventually. The end result of all the decisions that we see with standardized testing. Lovely thing. But yeah, it didn't advance from there, and everything still remained the same. Of course, we still have it to this day. So due to the prioritization of standardized testing, the students have gaps in other content information because we cared so much about test numbers that we forgot everything else. And educational experiences, forget about it. We literally forgot everything else. The applicable skills that you might need for work, right? Because the original intention was to make sure that they could end up well in the workforce. Yeah, that went out the window a little bit too. Now it's just all about standardized testing. They gotta have the highest of numbers. Yeah, it's to the point where it's like, I don't think these kids even know how to work. They're pretty much giving you information that's like, yeah, it could be useful depending on what field you practice, right? For example, a lot of these kids was like, well, I want to be a scientist, so this could actually be applicable for me. Wonderful. Love that. Not against, somebody wanting to be a scientist someday or somebody wanting to be a mathematician someday. Because at the end of the day, these are important things to learn. But it seemed like with schools, they took everything else away. There's not as much of a prioritization on like health education. There's not as much time with that. It seems like the time's been cut short with that. The arts is always a debate on whether or not we should keep it. Don't even get me started on home ec. That doesn't exist anymore. Yeah? With these schools, they pretty much took away the skills that maybe people need in a real life too. It just seems like it's all about the numbers. It's all about competition, right? which also goes into the enforcement of hyper-individualistic and neoliberal ideals within school. And don't get it confused. Neoliberal ideals and liberal ideals, you're probably thinking, gee, no, I'm not. Despite the color that I'm wearing, do not be alarmed. Neoliberal is just a way to describe neoliberal capitalism long term. It's an economic system. It's not the same or the exact same as the political system that you're thinking of. Relax. And even in that case, there are issues with liberalism. I'm more on the far left-ish side of things. Don't worry. We'll explain what neoliberalism is later. The point is, with these ideals placed into the classroom and with the ideals of standardized testing be the highest priority, teachers just can't seem to focus on anything else because of that. I don't blame the teachers for pretty much focusing on the numbers because that's all the system seems to care about nowadays. That's what the No Child Act, Child Left Behind, if you will, has done to education. It's just like, here, focus on this and just this. What happened to everything else? We threw that away. We've got to make sure that these kids have the highest scores, but they're not going to be well-rounded if this is all that we focus on. Does it look like I care? Well-rounded. We start seeing these kids as essentially products since they were a young age. Well-rounded? I just care that they make me look good. Make sure these standardized numbers look high enough so that we can brag about them. Who cares if this actually helps them at the end of the day or not? I just want to look good. That's what matters. That's really what standardized testing is for. It's like, I just want to look good. Like, who cares? Who cares? Do you care? No, I don't care. I don't think you care. You shouldn't. Numbers raised. Make sure they stay high. And on top of that, because of the numbers, it was also, it kind of feels like the Hunger Games, because we're going to talk about in a minute how if these numbers weren't high enough, then I guess you don't get resources to teach the children. What's the point of teaching these kids if they're stupid anyways? You get no money. We're going to talk about how these numbers affected whether or not you got resources. Yeah, standardized testing, isn't it fun, everybody? I'm sure a teacher can go into even greater detail on how this has done a great amount of damage to the education system. But yeah, that is the simple summary of the number one issue, is the fact that it's outdated to this day because we still feel like standardized testing affects us even to this day. Like, it's still an issue. Still a problem. Still a problem. Now we're going to get into number 2, the second issue of the matter, which is underfunding. So now we're on to them being underfunded. But what do you mean? Politicians keep saying that they're putting more and more money into education. How could it possibly be underfunded? Let me tell you how they are financially screwed too. Don't you just love what this brings? It's like a box full of chocolates. You never know what kind of disaster you're gonna get. Or I should say a box full of spiders, but you expect the chocolate. Let's talk about how this ended up being underfunded. First things first, the receipt. So what we talked about a couple of minutes ago. The receipt of the federal funding for schools highly depends on the school's performance. So that Hunger Games competitive type of energy, yeah, it was really high, especially back then. I remember back then when I was in school, I felt like the pressures were on high. Like, they kept focusing on whether or not the students were performing well numerically, which I guess one could understand surface level, but when you really thought about it, it's like, that was so much stress and anxiety for little 7, 8, 9-year-old, hell, I would go as far as to say like little 12 to 17-year-old me, like ages 5, 10. I was stressed. These kids, myself included, we were about to fall off buildings because of test scores. We had to have consistent reminders that, hey, you know, this number doesn't really define you. Like, you'll be okay. I would argue it was kind of worse for the gifted kids, right? Because again, for this particular character, he's classified in that category. The pressure is times 10 because it's like, oh, well, if you don't end up with the same numbers as you did last time, I guess that means you're useless. And if you're useless, you're worthless. Because what are you if not useful? Hyper individualism and hyper independence. True American values. You only are as good as you are of use. That's it. So it heavily depended on whether these students did great on their test or not. Because if they didn't do great on their test or not, then what's the point of keeping spending money on them? Because again, they're not going to make you look good. Who cares if we're trying to actively have them learn? No, I want them as pretty little trophies that I can brag to other countries about. We can finally suck it up to like China and Russia in your face. But that did not work out. If anything, it made things worse. Okay? So instead of doing what we should have done, which was like, hey, if anything, these poor performing schools maybe need a bit more resources. Maybe you need to do research as to why they're not performing well. Screw all that. Poor performing schools, for example, states like Nevada, they tend to have fell behind. They were just forgotten about, pretty much, due to the resources seemingly being taken away as punishment for poor behavior. And it's like, well, if you're not going to perform well, I guess we're just going to take this and take it to a better performing school. You don't need this, even though in all actuality, maybe you do need it. No, you don't. So, Glam Glassland, aka their version of Nevada, what would have happened because they performed pretty badly compared to the other states, right? As one, I'm pretty sure their gifted kids felt the pressure times 10. Because it's like, you are the only ones pretty much making sure that this school has resources. Or in, Hisoka's case, if you have a studio teacher, the case would be, you are literally one of the few kids here, right, amongst your workplace that is making sure I get paid. If you don't do good, I don't get paid. I'm sure that's great to tell to a 12-year-old. Hey, if you don't do well, that means I don't do well. I don't eat. Yeah, my job depends on whether or not you are fully functioning up here. And if, the numbers on the paper says that you're smart enough, I need to know that you're smart enough so that I get paid. Because if you don't do well, I don't get paid. In the studio teacher's case. It's a bit more complicated than that, but really put it simply, it's like, I would get fired if you don't do well. You have to do well, right? And in the public school case, it's like, if you don't do well, we don't get resources. So for all the gifted kids, the pressure was times 10, because it's like, at this point, you are the only ones who are keeping the school having things like, for example, pencils. You're the only reason we have pencils. We have books, pencils. You're the only reason we have those. So please, oh God, I beg. It was a great time. I'm sure those kids were fine. And they didn't just go consistently. I'm sure they weren't stressed out, though. It was okay. Yeah, no pressure, So for those states like Nevada, the pressure was times 10 because there was poor performance. Students were dropping out, and the students that remained in any way, shape, or form, whether or not it was homeschooling, public school, whatever, it's like the pressure was on them times 10 because everybody else just seemed to have not cared. And it's mostly because with states like Nevada, again, it's not really the kids' fault per se. It's just that their surroundings, as you can imagine, it's like it's a tourist state. People, the adults around them tend to have prioritized things like casinos. Again, it's Nevada. That was their main focus. So, other educational means and keeping kids kind of in one place to read, to be educated. It's going to be a bit harder when your streets are so full and so busy with other activities. Activities in which I shall not name because some of them are illegal. So yeah, Nevada's population growth was another issue because of the fact that there were so many people coming in and they had to keep changing the budget because of that. And there's only so many people that you can accommodate for when the education budget compared to the military, as we've discussed in the first education episode, is lower. Trillions of dollars into the military, and you had only a few billion, which gets diced up into millions for schools to then share. Yeah, but well, the military has no issues though. I'm sure it's going to be okay. We sure do know how to distribute our wealth in this country. We do not. So Nevada's population just kept growing and they kept trying to accommodate for that, but there's only so much that they could have done. So they then put a strain on the budget, in which Nevada had one of the lowest per pupil spending in the nation. Yeah. But again, this per pupil spending was not just Nevada. This went for all of the states during that time. I'm not sure if we follow the same thing nowadays, but at least back in the day of the 2000s and the 90s, it was based on per pupil, meaning based on the success, again, of each student. It pretty much depended on the student's success. To put into simple summary, it's a lot more complicated, but into simple summary, it depended on whether or not, each pupil succeeded. Every time each pupil would succeed, a certain amount of money would be placed into the school. Every time they didn't succeed, snatched away. Great things were done. I'm sure it caused no stress, or it caused all the stress. Who knows? But with this underfunding as a result, I would say that the teachers also suffered a great amount because when you're underfunded, you're underpaid. Okay. But on top of the underfunding, what added on to the issue of underfunding, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is the third problem, which is privatization. So the schools were outdated. They didn't update their rules, right? This is what we were working with. The same old rules from the industrial period mixed in with like the rules from the 2000s, which for him would be the rules that he started out with, right? This character started out with the No Child Left Behind Act. I also grew up under that, I don't think things stopped until like after the 2000s. Somewhere in the 2000s, that's no longer a thing anymore, or they changed it into something else. But in all honesty, a lot of the times with education, they only change it by name. The policy's still the same. It just has a different name now. I don't know what name it goes by nowadays. So, hey, if you want to put in the comments that it goes by this now, but it's essentially the same thing, go on ahead and do that. The next issue that we're going to talk about, of course, is the privatization. So on top of it being underfunded, on top of the resources being just spliced and diced and just chopped up to fight scarcity. Here you go, fight for your resources. Next thing is privatization. So pretty much public education was not prioritized at all. And they were prioritizing things like charter schools, private. For this character in particular, he fits into this category. And again, not to demonize alternative forms of education. It's just that it's more of a systems issue of, again, not distributing wealth in a proper way and prioritizing one type of education over the other, when in all honesty, it should be dependent on what kind of resources people have and making sure that people weren't left behind. Like everyone should have their fair share of the pie, but no, we can't have that in this country. We must have hierarchies. Somebody must be ahead of somebody else. We can't all eat, despite the fact that, again, if you look at the military's budget, we clearly have enough to eat. We just putting all of that into one place when it's like we got enough to put it into other things. Next thing is privatization. Let's get into that before I get too angry.
In this iteration of 3-Minute Theory, we bring you a concept that you might not know by name, but have surely felt by its far-reaching effects: neoliberalism. Simply, neoliberalism is the idea that society should be shaped by the free market and that the economy should be deregulated and privatized. Or even simpler, what works in the private sector will also work in the public sector. But it doesn't stop there. Neoliberalism also involves the idea that the public sector should not only follow the private sector's rules, but it should also subsidize the private sector, which we know is now owned by fewer and fewer global capitalists. While neoliberalism began to reach its current heights in the late 1970s, it has its roots in Enlightenment liberal humanism, or classical liberalism, the belief that people were free to live their lives without a great deal of interference from the government. So what does neoliberalism have to do with classical liberalism, and why does it matter? Well, neoliberalism isn't really new itself, but is a new take on classical liberalism. Neoliberalism uses the language and tenets of classical liberalism in ways that now benefit large corporate interests. For example, many of the tenets of liberalism were enacted in the name of equality, meaning that free market policies were supposed to allow people an equal chance into the marketplace. Under neoliberalism, however, the free market loses its ties to democratic ideals and instead allows corporate capitalists to open up previously unavailable markets. Basically, the free market becomes increasingly free for wealthy corporate capitalists and less free for everyone else. Although neoliberalism is a discourse that we cannot necessarily see, it has real material effects on many aspects of our lives. Let's take the American public education system as an example of how business interests have infiltrated public systems. In the past, public schools were set up to offer a free education to promote the liberal humanist ideas of liberty and equality. But with the rise of neoliberalism and in turn education reform movements, the lines between public and private education have been blurred. What we now see is heavy private investment from private individuals and corporations. In the name of liberty, neoliberals use the business-laden language of choice, free market, and deregulation to dismantle and then reconstruct public schools in a corporate image. This all happens through the use of language that sounds lovely and freeing, but ultimately doesn't prompt too many questions from the general public. As corporations take a stronghold in the public sector, we also see the reciprocal investment of public school dollars into private companies. Not familiar with the education system? That's okay, you don't have to look far to see neoliberalism at work. Remember, neoliberalism is everywhere, and it isn't limited to one political party. It's both right and left, and conservative and liberal, which makes it very hard to work against. So next time you hear a politician or CEO talking about the greater good, take a moment to wonder who's good. More often than not, the good being held up as liberty for all might really just be more money for some.
Okay, guys, so now that you learned what neoliberalism is and what I meant by that, we're going to go a step further. So now let's also explain privatization. So here's the thing, right? Due to prioritizing private and charter schools, money and resources tend to be taken away from public schools that were needed for funding, and it went into the public charters as well as private. So pretty much neoliberalism explained how everything adheres to corporate interest, and with private and charter schools, it depends on a company rather than like the government and, the legislative branch handling everything. So instead of it being the legal system and making sure everybody has that basic right, now it depends on a private company. And the difference between private sectors versus the public sector is that private schools, number one, are not as regulated as public schools. They follow a similar curriculum, but the thing about it is there's more leeway to go around it because, again, it's based off of a company's rules, not necessarily what the federal law says to do. They can pretty much loop around the federal. So anybody that has like a private form of education, some private schools, they tend to follow the federal law pretty fine, right? There's not that much change or not that much difference to a public school. And then you have other private schools that you sometimes wonder whether or not it should be even called a school. it's technically a school, but it's almost as if they just went around all of the rules. Yeah? What I mean by this is that some private schools, this does not apply to this character, but just so you know, some of these private schools can teach misinformation because, again, there's more leeway to spin and topsy-turvy around things. So certain subjects, like, for example, science, looped around, and you're wondering, hey, that's not factually correct at all. What are you teaching? You have to question, what are they teaching? But at the same time, there's not much that you can do because, again, it's based off of a company and not what the law itself says. It gets weird. In the case of pretty much like studio teachers, the difference is they're pretty much, again, a teacher that follows you around, but it's almost as if public school is following you around. They still have to follow whatever the curriculum is and the structure is from public schools for studio teachers. We'll get into the studio teachers and the breakdown of that. But for Hisoka's specific studio teacher, what would happen essentially is, even though this is an alternative form of education that's more so similar to like homeschooling, for example, similar to other homeschool programs that also follow the public school curriculum, it is pretty much as if you had public school but at home with you. So again, you don't have the traditional four walls. You don't have what people typically think of when they think of school. It follows you wherever you go, but the curriculum is the same. Now, if this were private school, then the curriculum might be different. It might be the same, but it could also be depending on what the school itself wants, which again may not align with the federal law itself. So with privatization, you have money taken out of the resources for public schools. They take it out, they put it into private and charter, right? They tend to prioritize private and charter. They tend to leave public schools behind. And that affects everybody who's underneath that curriculum, whether or not they are within the public school building. Like, just the whole system starts crackling, right? Because things are left behind, things are left abandoned, things are left being outdated because they're trying to prioritize these private companies. That's also not a good thing, because not only is it easier to spread misinformation, because again, it's not as regulated, the fact that they're taking money out from public schools, and as a whole, it's affecting the entire curriculum and the entire structure of the public schooling system. But also, due to wanting to cut costs, the quality of education from these private sectors, even though people think, oh, if I spend more money on it, that means the quality of education is higher. No, because of the fact that they're cutting around most of the time, not only because it's not as regulated, but also to cut costs, your child might actually be getting a worse off education depending on what private school they go to cut costs. Because again, it's based off of corporate interests. So if that corporation specifically all of a sudden goes, yeah, your kid doesn't need that activity, or your kid doesn't need to learn that, they cut it off, there's not much that you can do. Versus if they were to do that to, for example, a public school, then you could go to the board and be like, hey, what's up? You can't do that as much. I'm not sure if you can for, some private schools, maybe you can. Other private schools, not as much. Not unless, again, you're high up the totem pole for parents that they prioritize, aka their legacy parents. The fact that I have to say that for K through 12 or even college is kind of crazy. But yeah, it's like if you're not a prioritized parent, they're probably not going to listen to you. Versus with public education, where it's like maybe they won't listen to you, but you have a better shot at being listened to. Your quality of education might be just full on reduced because of the fact that they're either spreading misinformation or they're cutting stuff down in order to reduce cost. And it's not because they don't have the resources, it's because that corporation in question wanted to be lazy, which I feel like is worse. Like, at least on one end with public school, you can understand because it's like, oh, you just don't have enough resources. It hurts, but like at the same time, we probably just need to raise money ourselves to make sure that stays in line. Versus with private corporations, it's just like, oh, we have the money. We just don't feel like, the kids are worth it enough to keep it. I want to make more money. And this is not making us enough money. I don't care if, the children are not being fulfilled in that particular educated sector. Don't really care for that when I'm trying to make my dollars. That's all that matters to me. So, yeah, it's really a toss-up when it's depending on a corporation rather than the law. I mean, again, the law is something else. It can also be a mess in and of itself, but you have a better fighting chance than with like a private sector. Not to mention, like, I've heard the cases of racism also. Just a side note, the cases of racism for private sectors. Not saying with public it's any better, but with private, if anything, it's worse. And the chances of the person who's affected by the racism ends up being the one that's punished by the school, it's higher. It's like discriminations are not as protected in a private sector either. It's kind of just like, it's a 50-50 toss-up. You might have adults that care and you might have adults that don't care. And if you're near adults that don't care, there's not much that you can really do. I mean, you could go sue, but again, you would be suing a corporation and not a legal sector. It's a little bit different. We all know how it goes when you try suing corporations. When you try to sue corporations, things do not turn out as well. So, yeah, private school, I thought back then that it was the ideal, but the more research that I do about them nowadays, it's like, kind of glad. I didn't end up that particular way. Some might argue that I have more of a charter education, if anything. I wouldn't know how to classify my education specifically, but yeah, just trust me, especially with, again, like these specific religious schools. Not to say that if you went to religious school, you're a bad person or anything, right? Because I'm not moralizing anything. I'm just saying in general, it depends on whoever owns it and their corporate interest. If they care about the kids, great. If they don't, hey, man, it is what it is, unfortunately. The next thing that I want to get into is, again, they're cutting costs, they're skimming on staff. That's another thing, right? So with the staff, I would argue that the background checks for private school, it might be a little bit worse. Because again, they don't really have to prioritize it if they don't want to, type of thing, right? They might be like, oh, we don't have enough staff. Because again, the corporation says it'll be too much money, rather than, again, we don't have enough. They have enough. They're just being lazy about it. I feel like that's worse. Like, okay, that's far worse. Far worse. Like, what are we doing? Far worse. It's just a toss-up. You can't really be as definitive with private school. And again, I'm just saying it's negatives. I'm sure there's a lot of positives with private schools as well. There's plenty of reasons why people might pick private schooling. Again, you're not the devil reincarnate if this is your choice of schooling, or if you have been schooled in this particular way and you turned out fine. Because again, there's plenty of issues with public school. The issue is, again, when the government decides public school's not worth it, even though for a lot of people that's all they can afford, and they prioritize private and charter schools, when not only is it something that might not be affordable to some people, but let's say that, okay, there's leeway, there's a way that you can afford it. Discrimination's not just racially, but a lot of times with disabled people. There's also discriminations with that. For this particular character that we're studying, I heavily theorize this character to have, like, for example, ADHD. Let's say your kid has ADHD, right? Their needs might not be as met at a private school. With public school, especially nowadays, I mean, it's looking a hot mess. But at private school, you might have no chance at all. They might straight up reject your kid because they're disabled. Versus in a public school, I'm pretty sure they're not allowed to do that. Or there might be other options within the public sector. I cannot say the same for the private because, again, they're allowed, quote unquote, to say, hey, we just straight up can't accept your kid. It won't be really breaking as many laws because it's private and their company, their rules type logic, as messed up as it is. It's very messed up. Now, again, is this all private schools? Absolutely not. But for those that tend to follow that rule, there's not much you can say because it's a private company. And this country, the U.S., in both versions, they adhere to corporate interest rather than the interest of the people. So if corporate interest wins over the interest of the people, then hey, what they say goes. Sad truth. Another thing and another issue in the last issue, on top of that, is despite everything, if they were to, for example, come to a certain decision. So let's say, again, you want to make a change. You want to say, hey, this is what's going on in the schools. I don't 100% approve. This change needs to happen. You would normally go to the legislative branch. And for specifically education, you have legislators and you have the state board. You have pretty much everything we said in the first episode. You would go to normally that specific sector. State Board of Education, all these different sectors to make sure that your needs get heard and eventually get met. You cannot do that for a private company because with private companies, another reason why that does not happen is instead of you going through all of these branches and going through the entire policy structure for education, what happens now is you have to wait for a contract from that private company to expire. Yeah, so if it doesn't expire, and these contracts can go 50, 100 years, 1,000 years, it's whatever the company decides. 5 years, 10, if you're lucky. But you have to wait, and just wait, until it expires. And you have to hope that, again, the next CEO, next leader, or whatever, listens to your interest. Because if not, you're as good as screwed. So yeah, with public school, you get your toss-ups. It's certainly not fair, I would say, but at least you get a fighting chance. I cannot say the same thing is necessarily the case if you were to go to private and depend on whether or not they're going to listen to you, because now the chances are slimmer. It has slimmed down tremendously, because going back again to the neoliberal ideals, it's all about corporate interest, not particularly the interest of the people. Depressing, I know, not as fun. The last thing, of course, that we're going to talk about is how this affects teachers, including studio teachers, because like I mentioned a million times before, studio teachers still follow the same public school curriculum. If they were hired by a private sector, then again, they would follow the rules of private school. So everything I mentioned about private school, it will probably more so adhere to that. However, I think with Maritno's case, he might more so do public school sector, because again, it's probably cheaper to do that. And he is anything if not a businessman. So to cut costs, probably more in the public end. But it's not too much of a difference. As you would find with research that with public and private school, it really depends on which public school you pick. It won't be that much different from private anyway. So eventually, this kiddo will be fine. This alien question will be fine, Gifted kid, remember? We've analyzed that before, so he's more than fine, if anything. Yeah, the next section is how this affects teachers, including studio teachers. Then we're going to wrap this up in a pretty little bow and call it an end. Let's talk about the very last thing that has to do with the issues when it comes to education. So the very, very last thing that I want to discuss is how it affects teachers
essentially. Dear, dear teachers, the true backbones of our society, and yet they keep getting dogged out by said society. Let's dive into how. First things first. Because there is an overemphasization, back to the whole standardized testing. Standardized testing. I'm on your ass. You are my number one enemy. Overemphasis of standardized testing means that teachers, instead of focusing on proper critical thinkers, right? Instead of critical thinking skills, instead of career building skills, they have to focus on the numbers, the bare minimum facts, instead of stuff that might be fundamental for students later on in life. They don't ever teach you financial literacy, and if they do, it's just bare minimum. You want to wonder why? They don't go in depth. They don't have time to. It's not your teacher's fault. They literally don't have the time to do that because they're so worried. Because, again, the higher administration's worried about the numbers. I'm on your ass. Standardized testing. Teachers have no autonomy to the curriculum to modify it. They can, again, they have a bit more freedom than maybe their private sector pals, but not by much. At the end of the day, it really depends on what the administration up there says. And if the administration up there is saying, hey, you got to do this, that, and the third, you unfortunately have to do this, that, and the third. Either that or leave is the option. And they be making some ridiculous rules that sometimes don't take students' needs into actual consideration. It'd be horrendous. But shout out to all those teachers out there who, despite those ridiculous rules, they still stick their necks out for students. Shout out to those teachers. But y'all also get considered the scapegoats. Teachers get considered the scapegoats of society. Everybody blames a lot of the education issues on teachers when it's like, no, I assure you, the teachers are not the ones that are making the rules. They're following it just as much as your kid is. All right? We are all struggling. We're all struggling. Whenever it comes to structural education issues that, again, has to deal with the board, has to deal with pretty much up above an administration, somehow the teachers get the blame. It don't make no sense. The next thing is the wages, money. The root of all evil, the wages. They don't match the expectation of the job. You have your teachers doing all kinds of things, not to mention they're paying for their own supplies, resources that should already be provided by the government. It's a government job, and yet they don't provide the resources. The teachers have to pay all the resources out of pocket. They are your kid's social worker a lot of the time. They're your kid's parent away from home, if you will. They're your kid's nurse. There are all these different hats that the teacher's putting on, whether or not, again, they're a studio teacher or the fact they're a teacher in the classroom. It is the same. I would argue with studio teachers, they are literally caseworkers. They still don't get paid enough. They don't. The average teacher, at least in Nevada, aka Glam Glassland, they get paid around $43,250 salary. That's not enough. No, that's either at or below minimum wage. If we're going to be for real. It's looking a bit messy up in here. It's looking messy. It's not looking good. Next thing is, the salary rate has remained the same. It's looking tragic. Okay? It has not increased. We have had multiple moments of inflation, and yet it did not accommodate for that. The salary is the same. Why is that the case? Such a low salary for a job that has high demand, supposedly. How are you not going to pay people enough but expect people to come in? It'll make no sense. You need all these teachers, and you're not going to give them the pay that they deserve? It's enraging, but the reason they don't do that, right, they don't increase the rates, is because of the fact it's considered women's pay. Any job that's considered feminine, it gets devalued within society. Therefore, people don't take it as serious. Even though, again, a lot of teachers are the foundation for pretty much, I would argue, everybody. Everyone needs a good teacher in their life. They need the basics taught to them. And yet, low pay. because, oh, it's not a serious job despite years and years of going to school for it. I would argue probably the same amount as a doctor. Some people, they went to school for 4 years, some 4 to 8, some people 10. And yet, the pay is lower than their fellow people who have masters and bachelors. Some doctrines, still not enough pay. It's absolutely insane. It's wild. Teacher wage gap is also a huge issue versus their fellow, again, degree havers, if you will. You have, for women, it's at 13.7% for the 2000s. For men, it's around 24. For all the time they have in school, it does not even out with the pay that they end up having. It almost looks like you went to school for no reason, even though you did go to school for a good reason. You can't be a good guide if you're struggling yourself. You could try, but your brain will be in survival mode. Your brain has scarcity applied to it. There's only so much you could teach people when you're struggling. I can't believe we expect teachers to essentially do that. That's actually insane. You're kind of expecting the impossible. You want to know why, for example, the whole pull yourself by the bootstraps is a stupid saying to say to people? You want to know why that's the case? Well, let me tell you, let me assure you, the main reason why it's so stupid, right, is because it's quite literally impossible to do. You cannot pull yourself by the bootstraps. You're just going to fall. And what people are expecting from not just teachers, but a lot of other jobs, we're just saying teachers for now because it applies to education, is you're expecting people to essentially fall and claim that they have somehow succeeded. At that point, that's just sadistic. But hey, the ways of American society. At the end of the day, it's not about you, the individual. It's about corporate interests. I don't really care. You're not a corporation. Neoliberal capitalism. Going back to that whole thing. They are willing to throw other people under the bus if it means that the ends get met. And the ends in question is corporate interest. You also have teachers in the United States. They make 60% less, again, than other professionals in other countries. So teachers from other countries make around 60% more than teachers here in the U.S. I've met some amazing teachers in my life, but they had to keep moving around. They had 2 to 3 different jobs. I've always wondered why back when I was a kid, but now that I'm older, I know why. And it's so sad as to the reason why. Wages only increase 1 to 2%. This feels like torture the more that I keep reading this. And despite the budget increases that the government keeps claiming that education has, it doesn't reflect in the people that job is supposed to be guiding the youth. You can't expect them to do that and then have them struggle at the same time. They don't have enough time to plan and collaborate because they're out here having to do other things. Because all in all, the U.S. society doesn't value education. It doesn't. We put most of our money, first off, in the military, which I'll talk more about in and of itself, our military-industrial complex. But it's a problem because it affects literally everything else. And then we wonder why people come out seemingly knowing nothing, right? I can't blame the teachers. The system is in fact broken. Or maybe it's working as intended, because like I said, maybe they don't really care what happens down here as long as the kids within the upper class are having their needs met. Because that's what pertains to corporate interests. Then I guess screw everybody else. Survival of the fittest. And the fittest, in this case, are the wealthy. I can't help but feel shame just saying that. The administration can also be a problem, right? When you have a lack of support from administration, they don't discipline kids the right way, or they don't know how to handle unruly kids. The unruly kids just get passed on. You're just passing them. No child left behind. That means you skim over their grades. Doesn't actually matter if they learned anything or not. They just passed the class. Mess. Absolute mess. You got the mishandling of angry parents. Parents' needs are not actually being met. The teachers are stressed out. What are we doing? In the case specifically for Hisoka, I will say that because his manager is his parent or legal guardian, things are a bit different, right? Because in a way, it's a weird mix of having your principal be your parent, which, by the way, I had a friend that also had our principal be her parent. So that's an interesting relationship to have. So that is slightly different. But for most other people, both sides are not being heard properly. Then you have favoritism of certain staff members. Now, again, in the case of it for Hisoka, it's like this might not happen, only because of the fact that there's only a few kids. I would say like 1 to 2, maybe 3. I'm pretty sure 2 only. So it's like, it's not really much to worry about as far as staff members go. Studio teachers, there's only one. So there's only one person that they tend to handle everything as far as education goes. Only one person tends to fall around the kids. It's not really a team unless a team was hired, but for the most part, it's just one person. So there's no favoritism because it's really just that person and the administration in question, or whoever takes the lead when it comes to enforcing what should be the educational standards. You have constant blame and high competition, not just amongst students, but also amongst teachers. Now it just seems like they're competing against each other, saying who's the best of the best, instead of collaborating and working together. It just seems very tense, right? And this is not only, again, with individual teachers within a classroom, but amongst like who's the best of the best with like studio teachers and stuff. It is slightly different. You're not really combating toe to toe per se, but the issues still persist. And this is mostly due to triangulation. So a lot of the times with administration, there's favoritism. There's, oh my God, this is obviously the perfect choice. Nobody else can compare. In a classroom setting, especially, that can be problematic because there should be no favoritism. We should be collaborating as coworkers. With studio teachers, the lucky part is, again, you are normally independent, so you're not really competing with anybody else as far as who gets to educate the children the best. There's also toxic positivity and PR obsession. Now, this is something that studio teachers have to deal with all the time, because say that something bad happened on set, and instead of actually having it be handled, more likely than not, it'll probably get swept under the rug or be covered up, and then, PR will clean it up instead and be like, oh, nothing bad really happened. Don't report it. They have no choice but to report it because, again, they're also a caseworker. They have no choice but to report it. But then something like, oh, they have to get paid off, or something is like, yeah, report it, sure, but this can't be reported to the public. They'll never know. And I'm sure in Hisoka's case, a lot of those cases have probably happened where it's just like, we have no choice but to report it, but at the same time, the money and other things will keep it under the rug. There is not much that you can do, which I'm sure has resulted in a lot of psychologically damaged events. Just a lot of psychological damage. But hey, that's just what happened. That's just what happened. You got optics instead of actual performance. So again, especially with gifted kids, where it's like you don't have to do that much. You don't have to do that much work to make sure that they quote unquote look good, because that's really all that matters, right? It's like they got to look good in everything, right? The numbers got to look good. Their performance in general, if you're talking like gifted and talented children, have to look good. It's all about the optics. The kids' well-being comes second to how they look. Because again, these children are just a product. This is what happens when corporate interests take over. Now the children are the product. You're selling good children. You have added labor applied to the teachers. You got inconsistency in rules. The rules keep switching around, especially again with studio teachers, because it's based on the director, and the director could be like, I want this to happen. It may not be safe for the kids. That does not matter because the show must go on. And there's just certain things and criteria that we have to meet because, again, this is an adult environment. Kids are not the first consideration. Safety gets pushed to the side on occasion. You got micromanagement going on. You'll be like, hey, this, that, and the fourth. With Marino being like, oh, these have to be done by today. Or we got to shorten the math lesson today because we have to teach them this. And it's just like, we can't do that. We can't shorten the time. And it's like, you're going to have to work around that. You're going to have to figure out some kind of compromise. Like, if I were a studio teacher, I would be so overall stressed. But before I conclude, I just want you guys to watch a quick video as to what I mean by teachers not being paid enough and what that looks like as an example. So before I end and conclude today's video, I just want you to see that quick example, and then we'll come back with the conclusion.
This is Anna. She just graduated from college in the United States. And this is Sophia. She also just graduated from college in Finland. Anna and Sophia both want to be middle school teachers, but it turns out there's a good chance their experiences will be very different. So different that Anna is twice as likely as Sophia to leave teaching for good. That's causing a problem. The supply of new certified teachers in the United States is shrinking, but the number of public school students keeps growing.
Massive teacher shortages.
Warnings about teacher turnover.
Educators call Colorado's teacher shortage a crisis.
So what makes Sophia stay and Anna leave? And how can the United States keep more of its teachers in the classroom? In the U.S., teachers work about 9.25 hours a day. That's an hour and a half longer than the average for teachers in other countries in the Organization for Economic Development, or OECD for short. That's a group of mostly wealthy countries that economists often compare to one another. Teachers in the U.S. work more than 2.5 hours longer than their colleagues in South Korea, Finland, and Israel. There are some countries with similar teacher work hours to the United States, like New Zealand, Singapore, and the UK. Teachers in Japan, for example, work nearly 2 hours more per day than teachers in the US. But in all of these countries, teaching hours are much lower. Of the 9.25 hours that American teachers work every day, they spend about 5.5 of those hours actually teaching. That's more than the OECD average, and significantly more than teachers in New Zealand, the UK, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. Teachers in these countries get more time for planning, grading, and collaborating with each other. So, do all those extra teaching hours translate to better results? Students in the US score slightly above the OECD average on the PISA exam, which tests 15-year-olds all over the world in reading, science, and math. But they score lower than students in countries like Finland, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore, where teaching hours are much lower. If we look inside Anna and Sophia's classrooms in the US and Finland, we'd see Anna teaching an hour and a half more per day than Sophia. Anna also spends more time planning lessons, grading student work, and leading extracurricular activities. But those extra hours aren't necessarily reflected in Anna's paycheck. If you compare Sophia to other people in Finland with college degrees, she makes about 98 cents for every dollar that they make. That's on par with the pay ratio between teachers and college graduates in similar countries. But Anna and other American middle school teachers only make about 65 cents for every dollar that their college-educated peers make. Still, as politicians in the U.S. never tire of pointing out, we spend
more per student than almost any country, I think.
Than nearly every other country in the developed world.
But that figure varies a lot by state. New York spends twice as much as California on each student. Mississippi spends less than half as much as Alaska. And American schools generally spend a lot more on security and other non-instructional costs than schools in other countries. Plus, if you look at the share of its national wealth, or GDP, that each country spends on education, you can see there are plenty of countries spending a bigger share than the U.S. There's one other difference between Anna and Sophia. When they're asked whether people in their country value teachers, 2 out of 3 Finnish teachers say yes, but just 1 in 3 American teachers agree. There are a lot of reasons why teachers like Anna leave the classroom, but if the U.S. wants to keep more of them around, we might want to take a few pages from Finland's book.
In conclusion, education, when it comes to the U.S.S., has many issues. And those issues then bleed into the kids that are affected, as well as everybody else that is within said system, right? The kids are affected because their needs are not being properly met. The adults around them are being affected by it. Their teachers are having to shift and change based on standards that are very much so outdated, that refuse to evolve and push to the best of the students' benefit. You have people higher up above in administration, principal on the lower end, and of course you have legislator at the highest, you have the state board at the highest, pretty much being like, listen, we can only do so much, because most people at the legislative branch are like, let's move to privatize education. Children are becoming more so seen as numbers and products due to things like standardized education and the infiltration of neoliberal capitalism within education. And all of this does take into effect for particularly Hisoka's character, especially considering the fact that he has ended up growing up so hyper-independent and hyper-individualized. It's important to see kind of the starting seeds of where that came from. And one of it is education, but that's not the only one. There are plenty of other things that has eventually made this man to be who he is. This is just one of those many foundations. Right after his mother passed, somebody else had to raise him. We ended up here. Where pretty much, okay, someone else had to raise him, so it ended up being his manager. You're a working kid, now you're installed into the system. There's probably also a good reason why he is so rebellious, so to speak, is because, again, when you are set more so into a system that's so factory setting, with the mixture of education and entertainment, where you have these systems in place that essentially have heavy control amongst children, it's only fair that on both ends, those kids eventually want to evolve past that and therefore rebel. So you see a lot of adults that either are fine with the status quo or want to move outside the box. As one of the quotes that I have mentioned earlier in this episode, essentially, education is not really, or not education, I should say, the education system, right? How it's been placed within American society. It was not made for the free thinker in mind. It wasn't. Why would you have a free thinker when the whole point is to first install a factory worker and second install just a worker in general? Not to mention the school to prison pipeline, which if you look into all the rules set into school, and then you see the school and prison pipeline connections, it's not a coincidence. It's not. Now, how does this all pertain to this character? Again, maybe not everything, but certain aspects. Again, the competitiveness, the making sure that compared to your classmates, peers, whatever, you are considered the best of the best. So having, again, the gifted program kind of adhere to that. Having this hierarchy set into place, set into motion, a sense of superiority. It's instilled in children at a young age. And then we wonder how they could be so messed up later in adulthood. It does not surprise me. It's not education in and of itself, because there's beauty in wanting to learn. It's the system that's the problem, not the whole function of education. The function of education is altruistic. To want to learn is a beautiful thing. However, to control said desire, said grace of learning, it starts to become a problem. When, again, you have neoliberal capitalistic interest, you have authoritarian interest, it infects the beauty of learning. And eventually you'll want people that want to rebel outside of that. That is the final conclusion for today's episode. For the next episode after issues, we're going to go into racial factors. So pretty much all of what we said, but now racial factors, considering my personal theories for this character's race. We talked about how, at least with my theory, that though he was of mixed race, he was heavily raised as someone who is of Hispanic Romani origins due to his mother. So we're going to see how some of that applies to the racial factors of education and how that adds on top of the other issues. And then after that, it will pretty much be our conclusion for the education series, because we'll then move on to do my favorite section, which is the mental health section. So we'll see how some of this, amongst certain other things, that when it comes to mental health, at least amongst children, how that affects Hisoka's character. We're going to dive deep into that. But before we dive deep into that, we'll have racial factors. Then we'll have how does this apply in the manga. So we'll see small inklings of evidence for education for the manga and pre-canon manga specifically. And then after that, we'll start with the mental health section. Guys, it's almost finished. We're almost done. If you liked what you saw, please remember to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you're anywhere else, please make sure to do a like and a follow, and please share this to anybody else who is interested into manga, anime, just deep dives, character deep dives in general. I love you guys. Thank you for those of you that have been supporting me. Make sure that you click on all the links within the Hoobie, and I will see you guys next time.